They say when you are sold to a monster, you should prepare for the dark. But the man waiting for me at the altar didn't want to break me. He wanted to crown me. Rain lashed the windows of her father's downtown office, mirroring the panic tightening in Elena's chest. Elena Marchetti stood frozen by the mahogany bookshelf, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was 26, a brilliantly capable woman who possessed a deep, forbidden knowledge of medicine, and comfortably a size 18. In her family's superficial world, her weight had long made her invisible, but it was her soul they truly crushed, blaming her for her mother's death a decade ago. She had spent years playing the role of a family curse, hiding her clinical mind out of sheer shame. Across the room sat Mateo Chávez. He was the city's most feared syndicate leader, a man of ice-cold detachment and absolute power. And as Elena had just discovered, her father had gambled away her freedom to settle a sudden, astronomical debt. Elena braced herself for immediate cruelty, expecting to be dragged off into a nightmare. Instead, Mateo stood up, his piercing gaze demanding her attention. "Pack whatever fits in one suitcase," his resonant voice cut through the air. "We are getting married in 3 hours." The ride to the Gold Coast was a blur of gray Chicago rain and suffocating silence. Elena sat in the back of the pristine black town car, sandwiched between two of Mateo's towering, silent security guards. She kept her eyes fixed on her lap, her fingers tracing the hem of her oversized coat. She was bracing for the humiliation she knew was coming. In her father's world, she was a shadow, the size 18 disappointment whose medical hands were deemed a curse. Now, she was being marched toward an altar like a lamb to the slaughter. When the car pulled up to an exclusive, high-end bridal boutique, Elena's stomach bottomed out. The shop owner, a pristine woman named Genevieve, with a razor-sharp gaze, took one look at Elena's full figure and visibly panicked. Off-the-rack designer gowns were built for the whisper-thin socialites of her father's circle, not for a woman with wide hips, a soft waist, and heavy breasts. We don't usually accommodate walk-ins of this nature," Genevieve stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward Mateo, who stood near the entrance like a dynamic, looming shadow. "The proportions are entirely wrong for our current inventory. It will look completely ridiculous." The familiar, bitter poison of shame burned in Elena's throat. She lowered her head, prepared to endure the tight, restrictive silk gown Genevieve reluctantly pulled from the back. A dress that squeezed her ribs, suffocated her breathing, and made her feel utterly grotesque in her own skin. When Elena finally stepped out of the fitting room, staring at her reflection in total defeat, she braced herself for Mateo's scoff. She expected the cruel remarks she had survived her entire life. Mateo lowered his phone. His piercing gaze swept over her, but he didn't scoff. Instead, his jaw set into stone, and his eyes darkened with a terrifying, protective fury. He stood up, effortlessly towering over the terrified boutique owner. "Take it off her," he ordered, his voice a low, lethal baritone that vibrated through the room. Elena flinched, her heart plummeting. "Here it comes," she thought, the decades of her family's psychological conditioning screaming in her ear. "He realizes I'm too fat to be a mafia wife. It's restricting her breathing." Mateo snapped at Genevieve, his tone slicing like ice. "Do you think I am blind? Bring her the custom-cut, heavy lace gown from the vault, the one designed with an intricate structured corset meant to support a real woman's curves, not suffocate them. She is my bride, not a mannequin to be squeezed into cheap silk." Elena stared at him, her lips parted in absolute shock. He wasn't disgusted by her, he was viciously angry on her behalf. 30 minutes later, Elena stood in front of the mirror, breathless, for an entirely different reason. The heavy, stunning ivory lace draped flawlessly over her curves, accentuating her full hips and framing her bust with reverence. For the first time in her life, she didn't look like an afterthought. The transition to the historic downtown cathedral was a surreal nightmare turned reality. The cavernous church was packed with Chicago's elite, whispering syndicates and her own judgmental family members, all gathered to witness the sudden, scandalous union. As the heavy doors groaned open, Elena walked down the aisle alone, acutely aware of the cruel murmurs rippling through the pews. Look at her, a plain nurse, a curse to her family, a visual embarrassment for a man like Mateo Chávez. Elena kept her chin down, the weight of their contempt anchoring her steps. But at the end of the aisle stood Mateo, dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo, his dark hair swept back, entirely unfazed by the crowd. When she reached the altar, her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her bouquet. The priest began the liturgy in a tense, trembling voice, the atmosphere thick with the judgment of 100 wealthy onlookers. Suddenly, Mateo raised a single hand. "Stop!" he commanded quietly. The priest froze. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the massive cathedral. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. He changed his mind. He's going to reject me in front of everyone. But Mateo didn't turn away. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between them until Elena had to tilt her head back to look at him. Ignoring the shocked whispers of the crowd, he reached out with his large, tattooed hands. He didn't strike. Gently, with an agonizing tenderness, his rough fingers cupped her jawline, tilting her face up until her terrified brown eyes locked with his piercing gaze. "Look at me, Elena," Mateo murmured, his deep voice carrying an absolute, unyielding gravity that entirely drowned out the room. "Let them whisper. From this moment on, you do not bow your head to anyone. I don't care what your father told you, and I don't care what this city thinks. You are mine now." He leaned in closer, his thumb softly brushing against her cheek, leaving a trail of electric warmth. "I pledge you a protection you have never known. Anyone who looks at you with contempt answers to me. Anyone who calls you a curse will have to face my wrath first. You are the lady of the Chávez house, and you will take up all the space you desire." Elena stared back at him, tears pricking her eyes as the absolute devotion in his gaze shattered a decade of her family's toxic lies. Behind them, her father and the judgmental guests sat in paralyzed, jaw-dropping silence. The monster they had sold her to hadn't broken her. He had just crowned her in front of the entire world. The iron gates of the Chávez estate groaned open, swallowing the town car into a fortress of absolute wealth and shadow. Elena kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against the intricate lace of her gown. The grand mansion loomed ahead like a beautiful, silent prison. The wedding was over. The public spectacle where Mateo had defended her was behind them, and now, the heavy reality of the night crashed down upon her. She knew how men like her father operated, and she assumed the monsters of the underground were no different. To them, women were property, vessels for dominance, or receipts for a blood debt. As Mateo escorted her up the grand sweeping staircase and into a massive, dimly lit master suite, Elena's breathing turned shallow and frantic. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them, sealing her in. She immediately backed up against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, bracing for the nightmare she felt she deserved. Mateo shrugged off his heavy tailored suit jacket, tossing it onto a velvet armchair. He loosened his silk tie with a slow, deliberate movement, his imposing silhouette casting a long shadow across the room. He didn't look at her with lust, nor did he move toward her with the cruel intent she had spent a lifetime anticipating. Instead, he walked over to a crystal decanter on the sideboard. "You can take the bed," Mateo said, his low, resonant baritone surprisingly calm. "I have a private study down the hall with a couch. I'll sleep there." Elena blinked, her mind completely derailing. The tight knot of panic in her chest didn't dissolve. It twisted into profound confusion. You aren't going to..." She couldn't even force the words past her throat. Mateo paused. He set the crystal stopper down and turned around, closing the distance between them with slow, measured steps, until he stood barely a foot away. Elena instinctively squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her head back against the door, bracing for a strike, a harsh reprimand, or a forced hand. Instead, a gentle warmth brushed against her skin. Mateo's large, tattooed hand reached out, his rough fingers carefully tucking a stray dark curl behind her ear. His touch was incredibly light, carrying an unexpected reverence. "I don't take what isn't freely given, Elena," he murmured, his dark eyes holding hers with an intense, steady gaze. "And I don't break things just because they are under my roof. Lock the door if it makes you feel safe. Good night, Mrs. Chávez." Before her mind could even begin to process the shock of his gentleness, Mateo turned to leave. But as he reached back toward the sideboard to pick up his glass of bourbon, Elena's frantic heartbeat suddenly halted for an entirely different reason. The decades of her father's conditioning faded, and the sharp, deeply ingrained instincts of her forbidden clinical training took over. She watched his hand. The large, heavily tattooed fingers that had just touched her cheek so gently were shaking. It wasn't the tremor of a man who was nervous or angry. It was a fine, localized, neurological quiver. Her eyes locked onto his profile as he lifted the glass to his face. Under the amber glow of the chandelier, Elena noticed the subtle, unnatural shade of his lips. They weren't their natural hue. They carried a faint, cyanotic blue tint, the unmistakable hallmark of peripheral hypoxia, a terrifying lack of oxygen circulating through his blood. Mateo took a sharp, slightly shallow breath, a microscopic grimace tightening his jaw, before he smoothed his expression back into an ice-cold mask. He swallowed the amber liquid, entirely oblivious to the clinical gaze dissecting his every movement. Elena's medical mind, the one she had tried so hard to suppress out of guilt, began to race at a dizzying speed. Tremors, subtle cyanosis, a masked shortness of breath. This wasn't the exhaustion of a syndicate boss running an empire, it was a pathology. The ice-cold king of the city was sick, and looking at the stoic, unyielding set of his shoulders as he walked toward the door, Elena realized the most terrifying truth of all. He had absolutely no idea. Sunlight streamed through the heavy velvet drapes of the master suite, waking Elena from the first genuinely deep sleep she had experienced in years. She sat up, the luxurious high-thread count sheets pooling around her waist, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, she forgot where she was. Then the weight of reality settled over her. She was in the Chávez estate, the forced bride of the city's most dangerous man. Yet, when she swung her legs over the edge of the plush mattress, the expected dread didn't come. Instead, her eyes landed on a small silver tray, resting on the nightstand. Next to a single white rose lay a handwritten note in sharp, commanding cursive. "The house is yours. Do not look for restrictions where there are none. Nourish yourself." Elena dressed quickly in a pair of soft, wide-legged trousers and a knit sweater she found in the impossibly large walk-in closet, somehow altered to fit her size 18 frame flawlessly. Descending the grand staircase, she followed the rich aroma of brewing coffee into a massive, industrial-grade kitchen. An older, silver-haired housekeeper was neatly wiping down the marble island. "Good morning, Mrs. Chávez," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Maria. Mr. Chávez left strict instructions before his morning briefings. He said you prefer your eggs scrambled soft with a side of thick-cut sourdough toast and fresh avocado." Elena froze, her breath catching. It was her exact, specific comfort meal. Her father had never bothered to learn her preferences. To him, every meal Elena consumed was a failed investment, an occasion for snide remarks about carbohydrates, portions, and her weight. Over the years, eating in front of others had become a source of suffocating anxiety, a shameful act she tried to minimize. She stared at the generous portion Maria set down, braced for the familiar, judgmental glance. But the housekeeper simply poured her a cup of rich, dark coffee and went back to her duties, humming softly. Elena took a hesitant bite. The food was warm, perfectly seasoned, and entirely free of conditions. With a strange flutter in her chest, she realized Mateo hadn't just provided a meal, he had intentionally built a sanctuary where she didn't have to apologize for sustaining her own body. He was teaching her that she was allowed to take up space. By afternoon, restlessness drew her out of the kitchen to wander the vast, silent estate. Her clinical eyes couldn't help but catalog the pristine layout, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the terrifying symptoms she had observed in Mateo the night before. The subtle blue of his lips, the tremors in his hands. As she neared the grand foyer, the heavy front doors opened, and Maria escorted an older man carrying a leather medical bag toward the private wing of the house. Elena slipped quietly down the corridor, her nursing instincts taking over, as she observed from the shadow of the arched doorway. Mateo sat behind a massive mahogany desk in his study, his posture rigid, though Elena could see the slight, exhaustion-fueled strain in his jaw. The older man, whom Maria addressed as Dr. Albright, was packing up a blood pressure cuff. "It is exactly as I diagnosed last month, Mateo," Dr. Albright said, his voice dripping with an easy, dismissive confidence. "Your blood pressure is slightly elevated, but these bouts of lethargy and localized tremors are merely the progression of chronic fatigue syndrome. You are running an empire on too little sleep. I'm increasing your dosage of the mild sedative to help you rest at night, and we will continue the daily vitamin regimen." Mateo merely nodded, his expression an unreadable mask of ice, entirely trusting the man who had supposedly looked after his family for years. Behind the door, Elena's blood ran cold. Chronic fatigue. It was a textbook, dangerously lazy diagnosis, or worse, a deliberate lie. A simple sedative would do nothing for peripheral hypoxia. If anything, depressing his nervous system further would only accelerate the underlying pathology. Dr. Albright wasn't just incompetent. He was missing glaring, lethal red flags that any trained medical professional should have caught in seconds. Elena stared at the family doctor as he walked past her, her hands clenching into fists. The ice-cold boss wasn't just suffering from overwork. He was being actively misdiagnosed, and if someone didn't intervene, the medicine he was being prescribed was going to kill him. The formal dining room was a masterclass in shadows and polished wood. A long, glittering table stretched between them, but Mateo had eschewed the traditional distance, gesturing for Elena to sit directly to his right. Dinner was served, a rich, savory braised short rib over truffle risotto. The aroma was incredible, yet Elena found herself staring at her plate, her fork hovering in midair. Her mind was a chaotic battleground, torn between the terrifying medical red flags she had witnessed earlier and the deeply ingrained instinct to keep herself invisible. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting to the rich food. The phantom echoes of her father's voice whispered in her ear, calculating the caloric penalty, shaming her very existence. "Eat, Elena." Mateo's low baritone shattered the silence. He wasn't looking at her with judgment. His piercing gaze held a profound, quiet gravity. "You look like you're trying to apologize for having an appetite. In this house, we don't apologize for taking up space, and we don't apologize for sustaining ourselves." The words struck Elena like a physical wave, instantly dismantling a layer of the toxic conditioning she had carried for a decade. She took a breath, the tight knot in her chest loosening just enough for her to find her voice. She looked from her plate to Mateo's face, noting the faint, alarming blue tint on his lips that the amber chandelier light couldn't hide. Elena swallowed hard, taking a massive leap of faith. "Dr. Albright is wrong about you, Mateo." The silence that followed was absolute. Mateo set his wineglass down, the crystal clicking sharply against the wood. His dark eyes narrowed, turning to chips of ice. "You're questioning my family physician? A man who has treated the Chávez family for over a decade? I am questioning a man who is actively endangering your life," Elena countered, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice remaining steady. "Chronic fatigue does not cause peripheral cyanosis. Increasing your sedative dosage isn't going to make you rest. It's going to depress your respiratory drive when your oxygen levels are already compromised. His treatment plan is functionally a death sentence." Mateo leaned back, his expression entirely unreadable. He didn't erupt in fury as her father would have. Instead, a dangerous, calculating intelligence sparked in his eyes. "You speak with a lot of authority for a daughter dropped off to settle a gambling debt. Did you think I didn't do a background check on the woman entering my home? I know you have a background in nursing, Elena. I figured your father hid you away because he found it unrefined. I assumed you were brought here to be a quiet caretaker, not to audit my medical records. At the word nursing, a suffocating wave of guilt crashed over Elena, threatening to drown her out completely. The memory of that horrific night 10 years ago flashed before her eyes. The monitors flatlining, the smell of rubbing alcohol, her father's roaring voice blaming her hands for her mother's death. You killed her. Your medicine is a curse. I shouldn't have said anything, Elena whispered, her confidence fracturing as she pulled her hands back into her lap, fighting the urge to shrink into the shadows. My family, they told me my hands bring nothing but ruin. Mateo didn't let her retreat. He reached out, his large, warm hand stopping just short of touching hers on the table, offering a grounding presence without forcing it. Your family used you as a shield, Elena. Look at me. She forced her eyes up to meet his. I don't care what lies they used to break you, Mateo said, his voice dropping to a fierce, unyielding vow. A simple caretaker doesn't spot a micro-expression of pain or dissect a specialized neurological tremor from across a room. Tell me the truth. What are you? Elena fought through the phantom weight of her past, drawing a deep, shuddering breath. For the first time in 10 years, she chose to stop hiding her competence. She chose to be a healer, not a harbinger. I'm not a simple caretaker, Mateo, Elena said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the quiet room. I was the top forensic nurse practitioner in my clinical rotation before my family pulled me out. I know exactly how toxins interact with human pathology. Dr. Albright is either completely blind or he is actively helping someone kill you, and if you keep taking those sedatives, you won't live to see the end of the month. By the end of the week, the sprawling two-story mahogany library in the west wing of the estate was completely transformed. What had once been a quiet sanctuary of first-edition books and leather armchairs became Elena's clandestine command center. Heavy velvet curtains remained tightly drawn against the outside world, sealing her inside a makeshift laboratory. With Mateo's quiet approval, she had used his secure, encrypted channels to smuggle in diagnostic equipment, a high-grade digital microscope, centrifuge kits, and advanced toxicology panels hidden inside ordinary supply crates. For the first time in a decade, Elena felt the familiar, cool metal of clinical tools in her hands. Her fingers trembled initially, the phantom weight of her family's blame whispering that she had no right to play the healer. But every time she looked at Mateo, the urgency of his fading health silenced the ghosts of her past. What followed was a meticulous, high-stakes montage of medical tracking. Elena became a shadow attached to his routine. She documented every spike in his micro-symptoms, mapping the pathology with a rigor that no ordinary doctor would attempt. She noted the precise hours his localized tremors peaked, usually 3 hours after his afternoon meetings. She measured the fluctuating oxygen saturation in his blood, tracking how the cyanotic blue tint on his lips deepened after he consumed his daily vitamin regimen. Throughout the intense process, a profound, slow-burn dynamic began to shift between them. Mateo was a man accustomed to absolute control, yet he surrendered himself to her clinical assessments with a quiet, uncharacteristic patience. More than that, he became the ultimate protector of her space. When guards or remaining household staff came too close to the library wing, Mateo's voice would cut through the corridor, dismissing them with cold finality. He personally ensured no one entered without her explicit permission, creating a fortress within a fortress just to keep her safe. One evening, after 14 grueling hours of analyzing blood smears, Elena sat slumped at the massive mahogany desk, her eyes burning under the harsh light of a desk lamp. She didn't hear the heavy library door slide open, but she felt the sudden, grounding shift in the room's atmosphere. Mateo walked in, having stripped off his formal suit jacket and rolled his sleeves up to his forearms. In his hand, he carried a small tray with a cup of chamomile tea and a plate of light pastries from the kitchen. He set it down gently at the edge of her desk, careful not to disturb her scattered medical charts. "You're running yourself into the ground, Elena," Mateo said, his low baritone surprisingly gentle in the quiet room. Elena looked up, her gaze instinctively dropping to his hands. The fine tremor was there, visible against the dark wood of the desk. Without thinking, letting her pure nursing instincts override her fear, she reached out. Her fingers, soft, steady, and warm, closed around his wrist. Mateo went entirely still. He didn't pull away. Elena gently turned his hand over, her thumb pressing lightly against his radial pulse, feeling the rapid, slightly irregular rhythm of his heart. For a long, breathless moment, the space between them seemed to shrink. She could feel the immense, lethal power coiled inside his frame, yet under her touch, he was entirely compliant. Her skin tingled where his rough, tattooed skin met hers, a sudden electric awareness snapping through the heavy silence of the library. "Your pulse is thready," Elena murmured, her voice soft but completely devoid of her old hesitation. She looked up, meeting his piercing dark eyes. "But your tremors, they aren't mechanical, they're chemical. I can feel the erratic neurological firing right under your skin." Mateo stared down at her, his expression unreadable, though his chest rose and fell in a slightly heavier breath. "Do you trust what your hands are telling you?" Elena looked at her own hands, still holding his. For 10 years, she had believed they were a curse, but feeling the steady warmth of her touch anchoring a Mafia kingpin, she finally felt the truth breaking through the shame. "Yes," Elena said, her voice ringing with a newfound, fierce conviction. "I do." Mateo's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a dangerous smile. "Good, because I trust them too. Finish your analysis, Elena. Let's find out exactly who is trying to take my throne." The rain returned to pummel the estate, heavy drops cloaking the library in a wall of rhythmic, isolating sound. It was past midnight, and the makeshift laboratory was illuminated only by the sterile blue glow of Elena's laptop and the harsh, focused light of her digital microscope. Elena sat rigidly in the leather chair, her breath hitched, staring at the screen as the centrifuge machine in the corner slowed to a high-pitched, whining halt. She had spent the last 6 hours performing a highly sensitive covert toxicology panel on the blood sample she had drawn from Mateo earlier that afternoon. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, cold with anticipation. On screen, the molecular breakdown of the blood serum began to map out, shifting from chaotic data lines into a distinct chemical profile. Elena leaned forward, her clinical eyes scanning the peaks and valleys of the mass spectrometry report. Her heart began a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. Suddenly, a warm, solid weight pressed against her shoulder. Elena flinched slightly, but didn't pull away as she recognized the grounding presence behind her. Mateo had approached silently, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over her chair. He rested his large, tattooed hand on her shoulder, not to micromanage, but to steady her as he felt the sudden, rigid tension spike through her body. The physical contact was electric. Through the fabric of her knit sweater, the heat of his palm seared straight down her spine, sparking a sudden, intense physical awareness that made her lungs pull in a sharp breath. They had shared clinical touches before, but this was different. It was intimate. It was the unyielding weight of a man offering his complete trust to the woman holding his life in her hands. Elena's skin tingled, her traitorous heart skipping a beat as his thumb subtly stroked the edge of her collarbone, anchoring her to the moment. "What is it, Elena?" Mateo's deep baritone rumbled right beside her ear, his breath brushing against the stray curls at the nape of her neck. Elena forced her eyes back to the glowing monitor, swallowing the lump of sudden heat in her throat as the clinical horror of the data fully registered. "It's not a disease, Mateo," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "And it's not an accident." She clicked a button, zooming in on a specific chemical structure that looked like an aggressive, jagged lattice cutting through his healthy red blood cells. "Look at this peak." Elena pointed a shaky finger at the monitor. "Your blood is loaded with thallium-14, a highly modified, slow-acting heavy metal toxin. It's nearly entirely odorless and tasteless, completely disguised in standard blood panels unless you know exactly which isotope to filter for." The grip on her shoulder tightened slightly, Mateo's posture going terrifyingly rigid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly into an ice-cold, lethal stillness. "Thallium," Mateo murmured, the word dropping from his lips like a jagged blade. "It's a specific, synthetic compound. Elena explained, her medical authority completely overtaking her nerves. It builds up in the neurological pathways over months, mimicking chronic fatigue and neurological decay while slowly starving your vital organs of oxygen. That's why your lips are blue. That's why your hands are shaking. Whoever is doing this isn't trying to assassinate you overnight. They are systematically eroding you from the inside out, making it look like a natural collapse. She turned slightly in her seat, looking up into his piercing dark eyes. The ice-cold Mafia boss was fully present now, his jaw set in stone, a dangerous, calculating wrath flickering beneath his calm facade. But as he looked down at her, the lethal edge softened into a profound, terrifying devotion. "You found it," Mateo said softly, his hand sliding from her shoulder to gently cup the side of her neck, his thumb tracing her jawline with a reverence that shattered the last of her doubts. "They thought they could kill a king in the dark, but they didn't count on my wife." The digital analyzer hummed a final, chilling note as the full diagnostic trace mapped itself across the monitor. Elena stared at the glowing lines, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. She didn't look up when she heard Mateo's steady, heavy footsteps approach her desk, though her skin prickled with instant, heightened awareness. "Show me," Mateo commanded quietly, his voice an unyielding anchor in the quiet room. Elena pulled up a new data sheet, the numbers scrolling in sharp, crisp rows. "It's worse than we thought, Mateo. This specific variant of thallium-14 isn't something you buy on a street corner. It's an industrialized, restricted medical compound. I cross-referenced its manufacturing signature against the Federal Distribution Registry." She spun her laptop toward him, her finger pressing against a line of highlighted delivery codes. "This exact batch was routed directly through the medical supply company that services your estate's private dispensary. The daily vitamins Dr. Albright has been prescribing you. They are the delivery vehicle. The toxin is being manually injected into your pre-packaged liquid supplements right here, under this roof." The room became suffocatingly quiet. Mateo didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed to razor-sharp slits of obsidian. The lethal stillness that rolled off him was absolute. "Albright," Mateo murmured, his jaw clenching so hard, the muscle leaped under his skin. "The man has looked after my family since my mother was alive." "He's either the architect or the delivery boy," Elena said, her voice tight with a mixture of professional fury and deep personal realization. "But he isn't working alone. To poison your specific morning doses without alerting the rest of the security detail means whoever is physically handling your tray is complicit. The traitor sleeps in this house, Mateo. They watch you grow weaker every day, and they smile while they pour your drinks." As the weight of her own words settled into the air, a sudden, blinding realization hit Elena like a physical blow. The puzzle pieces of her sudden, hurried marriage finally violently snapped together. Her breath caught, her hands clenching into the fabric of her trousers. "My father," she breathed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Mateo looked down at her, his icy gaze instantly focusing on her pale face. "What about William? The gambling debt?" "It was too sudden, too convenient," Elena said, a hollow, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "He didn't just dump me on you to save his own skin. He knew you were dying, Mateo. He's been tracking your family's assets for years. He knew your circle was compromised, and he deliberately threw me directly into the blast radius. I wasn't just a receipt for a debt. I was a distraction, a disposable piece he could leave behind so that when you finally collapsed, the Marchetti family could claim I was the one who failed to care for you. He wanted to blame me for your death, just like he blamed me for my mother's." The sheer cruelty of her father's calculation threatened to choke her, the familiar phantom weight of being a weapon of ruin pressing down on her chest. But Mateo didn't let her sink into the dark. He crossed the small distance between them, his massive frame completely eclipsing the sterile blue light of the monitors. He didn't look at her with the cold detachment of a syndicate boss. Instead, a fierce, protective fire burned in his eyes as he prepared to dismantle her father's traps once and for all. A suffocating wave of panic crashed over Elena, tighter and heavier than any corset she had ever endured. The library, with its digital monitors displaying the jagged chemical signatures of a lethal toxin, suddenly felt too small. She staggered back from the desk, her breath catching in her throat as the ghosts of her past came roaring back with terrifying force. "I am a curse." The familiar, toxic voice of her father screamed in her head. "Everything my medical hands touch turns to ash. I couldn't save my mother, and now I'm trapped in a house where a king is systematically being murdered." "Elena." Mateo's deep voice sliced through the ringing in her ears, but she couldn't stop the downward spiral. "I can't do this, Mateo," she gasped, her hands shaking violently as she pressed them against her face. Tears, hot and heavy, finally spilled over her cheeks, mocking her size 18 frame, her clinical mind, and her desperate wish to be useful. "You don't understand. If I make one mistake with the treatment protocol, if I miscalculate the detoxification dosage, I will kill you. My father was right. I am a harbinger of doom. My mother died under my hands, and if you die under them too, I will never survive it." She collapsed into a velvet armchair, her shoulders shaking as a decade of buried, suffocating grief tore out of her in a jagged sob. She expected him to stand there, cold and detached, disgusted by her sudden weakness. She expected him to realize that a broken outcast was a liability to his empire. Instead, the heavy, steady rustle of his clothes filled the quiet space. Mateo did something a man of his absolute, terrifying power never did. He lowered himself. He knelt on the hardwood floor, right in front of her chair, bringing himself entirely eye level with her. Before she could shrink away, he reached out. His large, warm, heavily tattooed hands rose to cup her face, his rough thumbs gently wiping the tears from her full cheeks. The touch was firm, grounding, and completely unyielding. "Look at me, Elena," Mateo commanded, his low baritone vibrating with a fierce, absolute conviction that demanded her presence. She forced her tear-blurred brown eyes to meet his piercing, icy gaze. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only a deep, all-consuming devotion that made her breath hitch. "Listen to me very carefully," Mateo said, his thumbs sweeping across her skin with an agonizing tenderness. "Your family threw away a queen because they were too blind and too weak to see her worth. They blamed you for a tragedy to hide their own failures. But I see exactly who you are." He leaned closer, his chest rising and falling against the edge of her knees, entirely unbothered by the space she took up. He held her jawline with a reverence that shattered the last of her defenses. "Your hands don't bring death, Elena," Mateo vowed, his voice dropping to a fierce, low rumble that echoed straight into her soul. "They are keeping me alive. Without your mind, I would be a dead man walking in my own home. You are not a curse. You are my savior, and you are the only person in this God-forsaken city I trust with my life." He pressed his forehead gently against hers, letting her feel the heat of his skin, the deliberate rhythm of his breath. "From this night on, you stop running from your power. You are the shadow physician of the Chávez Empire. You are my partner, and together we are going to ruin every single man who thought they could cross us." Elena stared into his dark, unwavering eyes, the phantom weight of her guilt finally lifting from her chest like smoke. The absolute certainty in his touch didn't just soothe her, it completely transformed her. The trembling nurse who had arrived in a storm to pay a gambling debt was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to rule. For the first time in 10 years, Elena smiled, a dangerous, beautiful light in her eyes as she accepted her crown. The transformation inside the Chávez estate was swift, clinical, and deadly. Elena moved through the library, turned laboratory, with the absolute authority of a surgeon in her own theater. She designed a rigorous, multi-phase intravenous detoxification protocol, formulating custom chemical binders to aggressively flush the thallium-14 from Mateo's nervous system. Acting as his shadow physician, she administered the treatments herself, monitoring his vitals hour by hour. Within days, the results of her scientific precision were undeniable. The cyanotic blue tint faded from Mateo's lips, replaced by a healthy flush of color. The fine, frustrating tremors in his hands vanished entirely. Under Elena's strict care, the ice-cold syndicate boss didn't just recover. He was restored to his full, terrifying strength, his presence radiating an apex predator dominance that had the entire household whispering in fearful awe. But while Mateo's strength returned, they maintained the public charade of his decline. To the rest of the mansion, Mateo remained a weak, housebound king, providing the perfect cover to spring their trap. The trap snapped shut on a bleak, overcast Thursday afternoon. Elena stood directly beside Mateo's desk in the study, her posture commanding and completely devoid of her old, trembling hesitation. Together, they had summoned Dr. Albright under the pretense of an emergency health crash. When the older doctor hurried into the room, flanked by the head of the household staff, he put on a theatrical mask of concern. "Mateo, my boy, I heard you had a relapse. We must increase the sedative." "The only thing increasing today, doctor, is your body count," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. Albright froze, scoffing defensively as his eyes darted to the size 18 woman he had long dismissed as an invisible pawn. "Elena, you are a mere guest and a layman. Step away from the patriarch's medical affairs. I am his wife, and I am the forensic practitioner who mapped your murder plot." Elena snarled, stepping forward to slam a thick leather-bound folder onto the mahogany desk. This file contains a complete mass spectrometry breakdown of Mateo's blood over the last 3 weeks, cross-referenced with the exact delivery signatures of the poison supplements handled by you and your inside accomplice. Mateo slowly stood up from his leather chair. The sheer, suffocating gravity of his restored, towering frame filled the room, instantly shattering the illusion of his illness. Albright's face drained of color, his hands shaking as he realized the king was not dying. He was hunting. "You thought you could use my father's debt to slide a weapon into my bed," Mateo said, his low baritone vibrating with a lethal, absolute finality. He stepped around the desk, his massive, tattooed hand resting heavily on Elena's shoulder, not to shield her, but to stand beside her as a united front. "Instead, you handed me the only woman brilliant enough to save my life and tear your network apart." With a flick of Mateo's wrist, his syndicate muscles stepped out from the shadows of the corridor, blocking the exits and seizing the weeping doctor and his accomplice. Turning away from the chaos, Mateo looked down at Elena, his piercing dark eyes burning with an intense, unparalleled respect. The frightened, shamed woman who had been sold to a monster to pay a gambling debt was entirely gone. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the most feared man in the city, Elena had completely rewritten her destiny. She was no longer an invisible outcast or a harbinger of ruin. She was the revered shadow physician.